My name is Amelia, and I would like to share with you something very eerie that happened to me a few years ago when I was younger and working as a receptionist at a funeral home in my city. You see, I had been working at that place for a long time. I worked during the day, so the place was always full of people, both employees and those attending funerals. Because of this, I didn't mind working there. If I had to stay alone, I probably would never have taken the job. I must say that in all the time I had worked there, nothing strange had ever happened to me. Paranormal, I mean. But it only took one experience to make me never want to return. One afternoon, I was at my desk during a funeral, so I had to stay vigilant at all times. But I needed to use the bathroom, so I went immediately. When I entered, I noticed that I was alone. I went into a stall, and while I was doing my business, I heard someone enter. I thought nothing of it and continued. However, what caught my attention was that this person was walking very slowly and making no noise. I thought it might be an elderly woman. But then under the stall, I noticed the person was wearing high heels, so I assumed not. I left the bathroom and went straight to the sink. As I was leaving, I noticed a woman standing in the corner of the women's restroom. She was very well dressed, but was just standing there, doing nothing. I told her that all the stalls were unoccupied if she was waiting to use one, but she only smiled and continued standing in the same place. I left the bathroom a bit confused, but I didn't think much of it as I had to get back to work. A few minutes passed. I can't tell you exactly how many, but suddenly, a young woman approached my desk to ask where the bathrooms were. I pointed them out, she thanked me, and she left. But not even 2 minutes later, this same woman came running out, screaming and crying, completely out of her mind. We were all scared, and some of us went to ask her what had happened. Her husband came out of the room where they were holding the wake when he heard her screams, and she just kept shouting, "It's her, it's Elena, she's in the bathroom." Her husband tried to calm her down, but of course I had no idea what was happening. I thought she might have had a hysterical fit due to the loss of her loved one or something. So between her husband and a few other people, they took her outside while I asked the guard to check the women's bathroom to see what had caused the woman to scream so horribly. The guard went into the women's bathroom to check that everything was in order, but he came out after only a few seconds, saying there was nothing and no one unusual in there. When my boss found out about the situation, she sent me to offer the woman a glass of water and make sure she was okay. So I did. Outside, the woman was sitting in a car with her husband and another woman. I approached them, and the husband told me it wasn't a good time for her to talk to anyone. I said I understood, but needed to know what had happened in the bathroom. I remember the man couldn't find a way to tell me because he found it incredible, but he eventually told me. My wife says that when she entered the bathroom and opened one of the doors, her friend Elena, the one being waked right now, was inside. I'm not going to lie, I didn't know how to react or what to say. I just stood there with a look of surprise on my face. The man, very embarrassed, began to tell me not to worry, that his wife had probably imagined it since she was very upset about what had happened to her friend, and maybe her subconscious had played a trick on her because she hadn't been able to say goodbye. I replied, "Of course, don't worry, sir, we already had the women's bathroom checked, but the guard didn't find anyone there." After that, I went to my boss's office to inform her of what had happened. She thanked me and told me to return to my post, so I did. But by that point, I already felt very uneasy because I couldn't stop thinking about what the man had told me, and remembering the woman I had seen in the bathroom just a few minutes before all this happened. I began to feel incredibly nervous and didn't know what to think. I never knew who was being waked in that room since my job was only at the reception desk. But I decided to get up and take a look around the room, because I had to satisfy my curiosity. When I saw the photo of the deceased woman, I don't know how to explain what I felt, but I almost fainted. Believe it or not, it was the same woman I had seen standing in the corner of the bathroom. I quickly left and returned to my post trying to process what was happening, as it was very difficult for me to believe that I had seen a ghost for the first and only time in my life. The woman who ran out hysterically was right. She wasn't crazy and hadn't imagined it, but I didn't feel like telling anyone. All I wanted was to go home. I don't know how I managed, but I finished my shift and left. After thinking long and hard, I decided to quit because I knew it would never be the same. The mere idea of having to go back to work there terrified me. In the end, I resigned, and it was the best decision I've ever made. But no one can take that bitter experience away from me, nor that woman from my nightmares. Good evening, everybody. My name is Oscar. It has been a long time that I want to share my story with more people because it is quite disturbing. In 2021, I was unemployed. I left my resume at many places, but none of them called me back until I received the call from the place I least wanted. It was for a janitor position at a funeral home. I had never believed in ghosts or anything like that, so it wasn't fear of working in such a place that bothered me. Rather, it was because it was a depressing place for me. I had hoped to get a call from any other job, but that wasn't the case. I needed to work immediately as I had already exhausted my savings from my previous job. I showed up the next morning, where I was given my schedule, all the instructions, and the rules. I wasn't allowed to enter certain rooms when there were bodies inside, among other things. The pay was good, but the schedule was what didn't fully convince me. Whenever there were funerals, I had to stay until they were over to clean up, even if they ended late at night. About 2 weeks passed and everything had been normal for the most part. I still wasn't used to being surrounded by bodies and seeing and hearing the horrible laments of people almost daily. But I knew that I would gradually get used to it. However, one night something happened that made me leave the place for good. That night, I remember that the body of a child arrived. I had to open and close the gates where they brought in the bodies, so I always knew about every deceased person who came in. I was cleaning viewing room number 2, which had been used for a wake in the past 2 days and was a mess. The 2 embalmers were already leaving. They wished me good night and locked up their workplace as they always did. I continued with my task, trying to hurry up so I could leave because I must confess that I didn't like being alone there. The atmosphere was very heavy and depressing, not to mention that you're there locked in with lifeless bodies. I remember gathering all the trash into 2 large black bags and putting them outside the room I was cleaning. I then turned on the vacuum cleaner as the floor was carpeted and started vacuuming. But suddenly, I heard footsteps echoing outside the room where the lobby was. They were so clear that I turned off the vacuum cleaner and dropped it in fright. Everything fell into complete silence. I looked outside but didn't move from where I was. I remember shouting, hoping one of the embalmers might have come back because they forgot something. But no one answered. I bent down to pick up the vacuum cleaner and hurried to finish once and for all. But before I could turn the vacuum cleaner back on, I heard footsteps running through the lobby, this time moving away towards the rooms where they prepare the bodies. I slowly approached the entrance of room 2 to peek out, and what I saw were the 2 trash bags I had left outside, completely turned over with all the trash scattered on the floor. I was more scared than angry because the funeral home was locked, and only certain staff had the keys. Inside, at that moment, there was no one else but me. So, I started picking up all the trash and putting it back in the bags to take them out once and for all. When I finally finished, I went for my keys, which I had left on one of the chairs in room 2, along with my cell phone. I needed them to open the door. But when I got there, I noticed that neither the keys nor my phone were there. I searched all over the room, but they weren't anywhere, which increasingly made my nerves stand on end as I couldn't call anyone for help since the funeral home's phone was in the owner's office, which was also always locked. I wanted to cry at that point. I was sitting thinking about what to do when suddenly I heard laughter, a child's laughter. I can't describe how much it made my skin crawl, but I decided to go out and face whatever was playing all these tricks on me. It was that or stay there all night until someone arrived. I left the room and walked towards the rooms where they prepare the bodies, as that's where the laughter was coming from. I remember shouting, "Rest in peace," repeatedly, knowing that whatever was doing all this wasn't alive. I stood in the last hallway, which was in complete darkness, where they put the finished bodies ready to be placed in the coffins. I didn't take a step. I just stood there for a few seconds with my nerves on edge and my heart pounding like never before. Then suddenly I saw it. A silhouette of a child peeking out from the room where its body was supposed to be, which was supposed to be locked. It was watching me, peeking its little head and hands around the wall. I was petrified. I didn't run the second I saw that, as anyone else would have reacted. I don't know what made me stay. I won't say it was my bravery because, honestly, fear consumed me as I watched that. But it was as if my body wouldn't react. I only remember saying, "Go with God, little one." And at that moment the silhouette went back into the room and didn't peek out again. I trembled as I went back to the room I was cleaning, and the first thing I saw upon entering were my keys and my cell phone in the same place I had left them. I left the room without finishing vacuuming. I simply took my things and went home with a very bad taste in my mouth and a lump in my throat. The next day, I only went to return the keys and uniform and to resign. I didn't want to go back to that place. Even though this happened in 2021, it still gives me nightmares. I don't know if it was the ghost of that child who arrived that day playing tricks on me or something else, but I didn't stay to find out. It had been enough for me just to see a dead person. My name is Felipe, and today I'm here to tell you about something horrible that happened to me a few months ago at the funeral home where I used to work. I was the night watchman there, of course, and a lot of people always asked me if I wasn't scared to work there at those hours, alone. My answer was always no. Nothing strange had ever happened to me, apart from the vibe in those places, which is normal since they are sad places with people mourning, creating a very low and lingering energy in the atmosphere. My post was inside the funeral home. My job was to monitor the cameras all night and check when something unusual happened. One night, as I was sitting watching the cameras and having a coffee, I heard something inside the place. I wasn't sure what it was because the sound was very faint. I stayed completely silent, trying to listen, and I heard crying. But it sounded very far away, so I couldn't be 100% sure. I checked all the cameras to see if I could find anything, but everything seemed relatively calm. I got up from my seat and walked around a bit, trying to find where the cries were coming from. The more I walked, the louder they got. There was no doubt, they were human cries. But they would stop for a few seconds and then start again from different parts of the place. You feel so vulnerable in that situation because you don't know what you are facing. You don't know if what you're hearing is from someone alive or something from another realm. Suddenly the phone rang very loudly and I jumped from the noise. I rushed back to my post to answer it. When I did, a lady on the other end asked me if everything was all right, if something had happened to her relatives' bodies or why we had called at that hour. I told her I didn't know what she was talking about, that I was the security guard and that there was no one else at the funeral home and that no one had called from there. She was very angry, accusing me of playing a bad joke and threatening to report me. I tried to make her understand that I hadn't called her and didn't even know who she was or why she was calling. Both she and I were confused. She told me she was the grandmother of the two young people who had arrived that night at the funeral home, and that their funeral would be the next day. She had just received a call from my phone, but when she answered, she only heard crying before the call was disconnected. She was very scared because she thought something had happened to her grandson's bodies. I was stunned, almost unable to speak. I repeated that I hadn't called her and apologized in advance, explaining I didn't know what had happened. I asked her not to report me because I could lose my job. She interrupted me when she suddenly started crying uncontrollably. I asked her if she was all right, but she didn't respond. She just kept crying. The situation overwhelmed me. I didn't know what to do or say, but through her sobbing, she said, "I know it was them. They were only 15 and 16 years old, and they don't know what's happening to them. They never should have gotten on that motorcycle." That's when I realized she was talking about her grandsons. By this point, I was struggling to speak, and an inexplicable tremor came over me. I tried to calm her down, but suddenly she hung up. I was left there in the loneliness and silence of that place, looking around more paranoid and filled with fear than ever. But I didn't leave. I did my job all night, thinking and rethinking what had happened. I will never know exactly what happened because I can't find any logical explanation. The only thing that makes sense to me is that those young people, like their grandmother said, were so scared and didn't know where they were. That's why they were crying and called home from my phone. It was a very strange and terrifying situation, hard to digest, but over the years, I've learned to have respect for the deceased instead of fear. Though after that, nothing was ever the same. I continued working there for a while, but eventually changed jobs, keeping only that terrifying anecdote to tell. Good evening, everyone. I wish to share this experience anonymously and hope not to be judged for what I am about to tell you. Some time ago, I worked as an embalmer for a very well-known and expensive funeral home where I used to live. When I started, I was told that there was almost always a lot of work since there were only 2 of us doing this job. My colleague, who had been working there longer, told me that other embalmers hired before couldn't handle the environment. Many things happened there, and even though we must be prepared for this not-so-easy job, those events overwhelmed them and they preferred to leave even without pay. She told me that at night when they were alone finishing a body, they would hear things outside the room. Sometimes it sounded like someone dragging themselves down the hallway, and they often heard murmurs in the bathrooms when they were completely empty. At first, I didn't believe anything she told me. In this job, you are trained not to fear bodies, to approach everything scientifically. I didn't believe in ghosts, demons, or any of that stuff. I was a very closed-minded and skeptical person. One afternoon, I arrived at the funeral home. It was my day off, but they called me in because there was a lot of work, and no one could cover for me. So I had no choice but to accept. When I got there, I noticed the place was full of people. Apparently, there was a funeral that was going to last all night. As I entered, I noticed a young woman sitting on one of the benches at the entrance. What caught my attention was that she was staring at me with a slight smile on her face. I just smiled back and kept walking. I went to the bathroom to wash my hands, and when I came out, the same young woman was there again, smiling at me, but now standing near the lobby, leaning against a wall. I smiled back and continued walking to my workspace where the bodies were waiting for me to prepare them. When I entered that room, I found my colleague preparing a body. She was sitting and covering its face. I greeted her, and she joked about me having to show up on my day off. We had that kind of relationship. I started talking to her about my plans for the night while she kept laughing at me. But when she lifted her head and I could see the face of the body she was working on, it was that same girl, the same one who had smiled at me when I arrived. I stayed silent for a moment, trying to analyze what was happening. My colleague, jokingly, told me that my makeup job was bad, but when she saw I wasn't responding, she asked me seriously what was wrong. I told her everything without hesitation because I was very impressed and needed to tell someone. I wanted her to say something like, "You imagined it," or, "That's impossible." But what she told me left me even more shocked. She said she had experienced something similar in that funeral home. Once, while preparing the body of an older man, she was alone since there were no funerals that night. She stayed to finish the job and heard the voice of a man outside the room she was working in, repeatedly asking, "Where am I?" in a trembling voice, as if about to cry. She went out to see if there was anyone there or if it was a spirit, as they were known to be plentiful in that place. But she couldn't see anyone. She found no one and returned to finish her work. When she turned back, she noticed that the man she was working on had his eyes open. She couldn't explain how that had happened. She closed them again and began to explain what had happened to him with much tact and kindness. She spoke to the body, making it understand that it was no longer in this realm and that it needed to rest. After that, nothing strange happened. She told me she was sure that the man who asked where he was had been the spirit of the man she was preparing, as he was lost and didn't know he was no longer alive. I asked her if the girl I saw was the soul of that young woman, and she said it was most likely. Although it was a bit disturbing that she was smiling and not confused and sad like the others. While my colleague was saying this, the girl's body had a spasm. This is something that often happens with bodies, but it felt very eerie that it happened just as my colleague was commenting on her. Without a doubt, there are many things in this world that we do not know or understand, and so many similar experiences shared by colleagues make me believe that there is something beyond death. Thank you for listening to these stories. I hope you enjoyed them. Much more content is on the way. Subscribe and activate the little bell so you don't miss any of the upcoming videos. Have a great evening, everyone. See you next time.